So last week I read chapter 1 of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, and I really liked it, so I was excited for chapter 2, but unfortunately it makes one mistake that makes it fundamentally worse than chapter 1. My name's Jack and I'm reading my collection of D&D books cover to cover to see if it makes me a better DM. If you want to become a better DM with me, then hit the subscribe button down below. So, chapter 2. What's in it? So coming off the back of chapter 1, chapter 2 of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden is really easy to wrap your head around. The goal of this chapter is to expand the sandbox from 10 towns to the wider Icewind Dale. And they do that the same way they did it in chapter 1, by filling the area with a bunch of really exciting and dynamic quests. Where things differ from chapter 1 is how the players receive the quests. So where they received the quest before just by entering a town, now because these quests are out in the wilderness, they're given quest hooks by specific NPCs, or they might hear a tall tale from a random person in a town. Now, you know, I'm not a big fan of front-loading these chapters with a lot of heavy detail, and this chapter does start out with a bunch of random dice roll tables and a lot of other detail, but I didn't actually mind it here because, like the quest writing, the writing here is actually really good and it held my attention. So that's chapter 2, but was it any good? Okay, before we get into the fundamental flaw with this chapter, let's talk about what worked. And the thing that really shines in chapter 2 is exactly what shone in chapter 1, the quests. So you remember from chapter 1 that the thing that stood out was the variety and the writing of the quests, and that is no different in chapter 2. So by the time these quests become available, the players should have leveled up to level 4, and the range of levels for this section are from levels 4 to level 7. So as the players scale up in level, the quests also become more dynamic. For example, in this section, you will deal with quests that have players dealing with the ghosts of frozen ice giants. There's another quest where you're helping spacefaring gnome mind flayers. And you can even hitch a ride on the back of a talking whale. But the standout for me in this section is a quest called the Dark Duchess. So the Dark Duchess is the wreck of a pirate ship that is currently stranded on the frozen waters of a place called the Sea of Moving Ice. Inside, the ghost of the former captain watches over his treasures that he refused to part with. But in addition to that, an ancient white dragon is using the pirate ship as a place to store its hoard while it hunts in the area. This quest is so cool. It starts with a super intriguing but incredibly simple plot hook in a pirate ship that's in a place it shouldn't be. And then it just goes to another level where an ancient white dragon gets involved, an enemy that the players have no chance of defeating, and becomes this really dynamic game of cat and mouse. To add some extra fun to this ancient white dragon is a fully realized character. The dragon's name is Archaeus, and basically they have been the apex predator of Icewind Dale for centuries. In addition to that, she has a saddle on her back with the corpse of her former wizard master, who she talks to as if he was alive. Then, in addition to that, this quest has this entire dynamic angle where a frost giant can come and help the party. And again, this frost giant is another fully realized character. This quest is just exceptional, and it's not the only one that's great like this. And that is why it is so disappointing that this section just makes this huge unforced error. So where did it all go wrong? It's really simple. In chapter 1, each quest finished with a section called Concluding the Quest. This section explained what actually happened at the end of the quest and when you could say, hey, this is over now. There's nothing more to do. This was really helpful because as the DM, you could quickly read the beginning and the end of the quest just before you ran it, and it would remind you of what you'd previously read. But for some reason, this section is just not included in any of the quests in chapter 2. These leave the endings of the quests quite nebulous and unclear. Let's take, for example, the quest I just mentioned with the dragon and the pirate ship. As per the book, the ending of the quest, super unclear. The party at some point while on the ship will be detected by the dragon. The dragon then starts pursuing the party, and eventually it's up to the party to try and escape from the dragon. As I mentioned before, the ice giant can come and get involved to try and help the party, but the only explanation of what the ice giant can actually do is a spell that it might use. After this point, there's just no more text about the quest. There's no explanation of what happens while the party is escaping. There's no suggested dice rolls, and there's no box text to read. There's not even an explanation of what the players need to do to consider themselves escaped. And you might be thinking that's because it's up to the players to figure out what they do and then that's what happens. And sure, that's fine, but up until now, the quest has been extremely prescriptive in what happens when they are in this place. The dragon arrives based on certain time intervals and certain dice rolls, certain things happen within the pirate ship based on certain triggers that the players do. So to provide no guidance at all at the conclusion of the quest, the most dramatic point is just extremely puzzling, especially when it was in chapter 1. In addition to that, at least one of these quests leapfrog the players to the endgame. For example, that quest I mentioned with the talking whale, that whale will just swim you directly to the island of the main antagonist of the entire campaign. But the issue here isn't that the players can take on a quest that takes them to a place where they might not be ready for and they might die. The issue here too is that this quest also just kind of ends. The players get on the whale and the text suggests that they swim to Auril, the Frostmaiden's island, the person from the front cover of the book, but then it just ends. It doesn't give a warning that the players are about to go and face the person on the front cover of the book. Hell, it doesn't even give you a page number to turn to if your players decide to go and do this. I actually had to randomly flip through the pages reading the first couple of words of each chapter to figure out where to even go next. So how do you fix this? So as I said, there's some amazing quest writing in here. So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think some of the issue here is that some of these dramatic moments at the ends of these quests, the mechanics of D&D either don't allow for them, or it would be so tedious to play out that it's boring. So take the dragon encounter previously. You could play out the moment where you're trying to escape with like maps and minis because the dragon has very specifically defined sight. But I think in practice that would just be extremely tedious. So what I would do here is create a skill challenge. So a skill challenge is sort of like a mini game in D&D where you combine roleplay and dice rolls with a set target number of successes. I won't fully break down what skill challenges are, but there's plenty of great videos out there about this. I particularly enjoy the one that Matt Colville made about him. But it's basically a way to simulate something really dramatic happening that would be really tedious to play out in the rules of D&D. So for example, running from a collapsing dungeon because you just killed the wizard who was keeping it afloat, or maybe running from an ancient white dragon with a dead wizard riding its back in a saddle. So I think it's that type of thinking that you need to apply here. You need to look at the holes in these quests and try and close the loops. You might be able to do that with some random dice rolls on tables, or you could take the adversaries that players face in these quests and look at them like 3D characters with motivations, and then consider how the players would achieve their goals with those motivations in mind. Could they persuade people, or do they have to use violence? If you know some of the ways that you can achieve success, then it's easier to know what success actually is. Okay, so in conclusion, did this make me a better DM? Before we talk about chapter 2, let's talk about chapter 1. So I ran a session after reading chapter 1, and I applied some of the things that I learned from that chapter. Basically thinking about quests from different angles and thinking about NPCs with those kinds of motivations that I mentioned earlier. And I saw a noticeable improvement to my players' engagement, the amount of roleplay that was happening, the overall amount of fun that I had, and a reduction in the amount of prep that I needed to do. So I think chapter 1 has definitely made me a better DM. But chapter 2. So I don't have a session in between now and the next chapters, so I won't be able to implement this right away. But my next goal is to take some of the dynamic elements that we saw in these quests and add them into some of my own quest design. Add some enemies that are designed to be fled from rather than fought, some unexpected allies appearing out of strange places, maybe a pirate ship at a place it shouldn't be. Okay, that's it for another week. If you enjoyed the breakdown, don't forget to hit subscribe down below, and we'll be back next week with the next part of this book. The chapters get a bit shorter here as we go into the end game, so we'll be reading from chapters 3 all the way through to 7. With all that in mind, I'll catch you next week, and let's become better DMs together.